for our teaching time this morning. If you would like to follow along on your device as an outline for the morning, you're welcome to do that by scanning that QR code. And we are in a series of messages that we're calling On Repeat, that there are some things that we just need to hear over and over and over again as a church family. And so we've been looking at the invitations of Jesus and doing it in conjunction with the focus of our church that maybe Mike was referring to earlier there. And today we're looking at the idea of empty the jar from the story that was just read and sung about. And we, as you have heard many times, and you see every time you walk out these doors on the east side of the building, our mission as a church is to help people find and follow Jesus, and we're very intentional about how we invite you to do that. That there are actually very practical next steps in various spiritual areas that you can use to follow Jesus. And so we suggest that there are four. You see them on the walls here, you see them on the stage, with Jesus at the center, that we invite people to stay connected to him. And so 2 weeks ago we talked about the idea that we need to be the branch. Last week we talked about this idea of shining Jesus' love and Jesus' goodness. And we used the story of the paralytic, and we said we need to wreck the roof as a church. And today we're actually on this portion where we're talking about investing what we have in Jesus' kingdom. And the story that we're going to focus on is just an illustration of someone who did that exact thing. And it's the story of this woman. But before we get into the story of the woman who goes for supper with Jesus, we need to actually do a little etiquette examination. I don't know how you are on your etiquette, but before we get into sort of ancient etiquette, let's talk about etiquette today, these days. How many of you would say that you understand etiquette? Yeah, some of you do. So here's the test. Okay, here's some questions I want to give you to sort of understand this. Now, the situation is this. The Pharisee invites Jesus over for supper, and Jesus was a preacher, so if you offer him a free meal, he's going to go. And underneath this story, there is this understanding of what takes place, some context that we need to get. And so a little etiquette quiz, first of all in our culture, and then we'll look at it in Jesus' culture. So today, when should you start eating the main course at a formal dinner? And I'm going to give you some options here, and you just tell me the right one, okay? The first would be after the hostess is seated. Is that the correct time? Not sure. How about after the hostess lifts her fork? Is that the correct time? Or how about this one? After 3 or 4 people are served. Not sure about that one. Or how about this one? This is my preference. As soon as humanly possible. The correct answer on this one, according to Emily Post, who is kind of the guru of all these things, she says C. After 3 or 4 people are served. Take it up with Emily Post if you don't like that one. Let me give you another test here. What do you do when the person across the table has food stuck between their teeth? Like, what is the proper etiquette in this situation? How about this one? Intentionally stare at the food to make them aware. I've done this a few times. It's like this. Is that the right answer? Or how about this one? You pick between your own teeth, hoping that they will mimic the gesture and get it. Like you're picking, they got the spinach between their teeth, and so you're just doing this one. Or how about this one? You just ask them if they're saving some for later. Or maybe this one, do you casually let them know? Well, this is actually a trick question because I don't know the answer and I want to know. How many of you would say it's A? B? Some of you are on C. That's what most of you would do. How about D? Yes, that's the correct answer on this. Okay, one more, and then we'll move over to Simon. What is the correct response if one's cell phone goes off in church? One option would be this, that you look annoyingly at the person, and you kind of shake your head in disgust. Correct answer? Probably not, but I've seen some of you do it at any rate. How about this one? If it's going to be you, you make it a worship song ahead of time. So it's your ringtone is a worship song, so it's kind of like a preemptive thing, just in case. Or I think this is probably the right answer. The right answer is you send the preacher a generous gift card. That's really what you should. Even if it's just on vibrate, that's still the right thing to do. Well, in the first century, there was all kinds of rules about etiquette that you didn't break, and that people in that culture would have known as just part of the way that they lived their life. And when Jesus comes to the home of Simon the Pharisee, Simon has invited Jesus as a guest, but he breaks a whole bunch of social etiquette. And he comes to Simon's house, Jesus does, and Simon doesn't greet him. And here's some of the things that Simon does that would just be super awkward in this situation. For one thing, there's no kiss. We say, well, I don't usually get a kiss when I go somewhere, but in that culture, you would. That's how you greet somebody. For us, it might be just shaking hand or saying hi. Simon didn't do it. He didn't do it. It would be like us blatantly ignoring someone that comes to our house for supper. The other thing he didn't do is any foot washing. Now, just a little history here. People at that time would do just like the drama illustrated for us. They're not sitting at a table. They're reclining on the floor. Plus, they spend their day walking dusty roads, not snow, dust, and they're in sandals. And so it's very traditional. We read more about this when Jesus washes the disciples' feet. But generally, you would have somebody wash your guests' feet as a thing of honor, because their feet are also going to be in the face of other guests. Literally. And the odor and the dust and the uncomfortability. So Simon should have at least given Jesus a towel to wash his own feet. Doesn't do it. And thirdly, Simon is super awkward because he doesn't give, usually what would happen is when you had a special guest coming over, you would give them some kind of inexpensive oil, maybe some olive oil, when they came in to sort of refresh them. Simon doesn't do this. So Jesus gets no kiss, gets no foot washing, no towel, no anointing at all when he walks into this special supper. All of that to say, commentators, historians agree that Simon is purposely ignoring Jesus. He's making a statement about what he thinks of him. And then, as you saw unfolded, in this situation, it's already socially awkward. Something takes place that makes it even more awkward. And the room goes silent. Talking stops. And you really have to picture the scene to get it, because Jesus has been invited, but this woman who barges in has not been invited. And she walks up to Jesus, and she's right there by his unwashed feet, and everyone is silent. Because the way that the text describes this woman, it's pretty clear, it's without question that this woman is a prostitute. She is a streetwalker. She sins for a living, you would say. So into this proper situation of religious leaders, in walks this lady. Can you imagine the disapproval? The glares, the awkwardness. It's just embarrassing. Like, how did Jesus know her? How did she know Simon? What is going on here? And Jesus looks at her, and obviously she's had some kind of encounter with Jesus because she comes to him and what she does next. But Jesus looks at her. I'm sure that he smiles, and maybe she's unable to remember the last time that a man looked at her like that. Whatever the case, she is so undone, she is so overcome that she starts to well up with tears. And they start to run down her face. And then they drop off of her chin. I don't think she came to wash Jesus' feet, because if she came to wash his feet, then she would have brought a towel with her. But she just starts to cry. And if you can picture it, I think it probably starts as like a sob, and then it turns into a full-on weeping. And the tears are so big from this woman that they leave her eyes and they splatter on the feet of Jesus. And she falls to the ground, and she notices that his feet haven't been washed. Because when her tears fall on them, they leave a mark. He's got dusty feet. And she begins to kiss his feet. She can't ask for a towel. No one's going to give her anything. So she does something that, again, would have just rocked the room. She lets down her hair. Now, in those days, women always wore her hair up in public. Letting your hair down was something that you did for your husband, and only your husband by law, if you get what I'm saying. She lets down her hair, and the whole room goes, In that culture, a woman letting down her hair for someone who is not her husband was grounds for divorce. And so in some ways, her actions here are more profound even than what she does next. She's sobbing. She's crying. She's wiping his feet, the dust off his feet, and drying his feet with her hair. By now, the crowd is doing more than just being silent. By now, I guarantee you, they're murmuring. They're gasping. And what she does next is almost unbelievable. She takes the tool of her trade as a prostitute, likely the only thing that she owns that's worth anything, this jar, likely around her neck, and she takes it and she begins to pour the perfume onto Jesus' feet. She pours it all out. And when she does this, you can guarantee this: the entire room could smell it. This was the perfume she used in the tool of her trade. She would just use a dab of it. Now she breaks it open completely and pours it out, empties the jar. Can you smell it? It's a beautiful scent. It's expensive. It's something that is saved for special occasions. And now everybody smells it. The whole room has changed. And she just empties out this jar at the feet of Jesus. There she is, washing and drying his feet and pouring out the most expensive perfume that she has. And Jesus, everyone expects him to stand up, here's some more social etiquette, to stand up and rebuke her. Like, I don't know you, what are you doing? I don't want to give people the wrong impression here. And Jesus, I'm sure, is deeply moved by this, but he can barely enjoy the fragrance of this perfume because there's somebody else in the room that has a very stinky attitude. Have you ever noticed every time Jesus goes to a party, there was a pooper at the party? Simon is dismayed that this tramp has come into his house. And he's even more disturbed that Jesus would welcome her. This is disgraceful, he's thinking. Simon is, just like we talked about earlier in the year, Simon is like Jonah looking down on Nineveh. Simon is like the elder brother in the story of the prodigal son, because Simon is now taking his place with a number of people who think that they need to help God, or God is going to just go out and give grace to a whole bunch of people who don't deserve it. And this is where the story gets fascinating to me. Simon's upset, and Jesus says, can you imagine Jesus saying this to you? Hey, I have something to tell you. And Simon says, okay, fine, tell me. 2 people owed money to a certain money lender. One owed 500, the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay. He forgave the debts of both. Which one will, get this, love him more? Simon says, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt. And you can just see Jesus kind of looking at him, looking at the woman. You have judged correctly, Jesus says. And then he turns towards the woman. But he says to Simon, this is a powerful question. Did you even see this woman? Do you see her? I don't mean did you judge her. I mean, did you actually see her? And then he cuts into Simon's etiquette and says, listen, you didn't give me any water for my feet. She wet my feet with tears and wiped them with her hair. You didn't give me a kiss, but this woman hasn't stopped kissing me. You did not put oil on my head, but she poured perfume on my feet. Ouch. And then Jesus drives it home with these words. He says, therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven. as her great love has shown. And then this line, but whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Jesus turns to the woman and says, your sins are forgiven. The other guests are like, what's going on here? Who can forgive sins? Jesus says to the woman, this is beautiful, your faith has saved you. Go in peace, or you could literally translate it, go into peace from here on. Doesn't give her a lot of instruction beyond that. That's all he says. If we were to sort of stand at this story and consider where we might step into it, notice a couple things. Notice, first of all, how Jesus treats this woman. Jesus does this. I don't know what you think of Jesus, but Jesus always does this. He finds connection, first of all, with the outsider, with the marginal people in the world. That's who he goes to, first of all. He goes to the people without the power. It's like he's showing them, he's trying to portray for them and trying to portray for us that he is a God of grace. You can put it another way. It's almost like he's mocking the world's standards of beauty and power and status and achievement. And he's saying this, the best of me, the first of me, my power is made perfect to the ones who admit their need. That's where it's going first. That's the reason why these are the people who usually get to me first. What's he saying? It's not your achievement. It's not your accomplishment. It's not your past record. Who are the people that get the best of Jesus and Jesus gets to first? They're the people who have nothing except their need. She comes in need and she receives grace. Can I just encourage you today? I don't know where you're at with Jesus or God or sin, but I just want to encourage you. If you have a need, then you have what it takes to receive grace. And I know that there are some of us in this room that can really identify with this lady. Oh, maybe we're not streetwalkers, but we have a record that we are embarrassed about. And I just want to remind you today that the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies are new every single day. Great is his faithfulness for you. Or to put it another way, today is a day of mercy for everyone who has need. Where sin abounds, grace abounds more. Grace is stronger. It's a stronger force than anything in your life that has been sinful. Well, that's the woman, but I'm guessing there's also a lot of us that don't just identify with the woman, because Jesus is doing something very interesting here. There's also Simon. Now, the reason this is interesting is because this happens fairly regularly in stories where Jesus encounters people. Simon, he's a Pharisee. Now, historically, Christians have divided sins into two kind of categories. I don't know if you knew this, but like throughout history, the Christians divided sins into two general areas. One area would be sins of the flesh. The other area would be sins of the spirit. So if you read some of the old guys who wrote about this, they kind of had these two different ways of talking about it. And sins of the flesh we're pretty much aware of. Generally, this would be what this lady has been involved in. These are appetites in our life that go out of control. Okay? So it could be lust, could be greed, could be drunkenness, could be laziness, sins of the flesh. Got it? Familiar with that side of things? Yes, we are. The other side that Christians acknowledged was there was another kind of sin that was called sins of the spirit. And they had less to do with our biology and more to do with our souls. And so they had different names for those sins, names like pride and arrogance and self-righteousness and judgmentalism. Now, sins of the spirit, generally not as colorful as sins of the flesh. And you could put it this way, John Ortberg puts it this way, he says that you and I, as Christian people, are often more scandalized by sins of the flesh. Jesus, on the other hand, was more scandalized by sins of the spirit. We know this because it happens over and over again.
in the New Testament, we have all of these stories. Like eventually you kind of pick up on this theme, that there's kind of this triad. There's a person that's a sin of the flesh person, and then there's a person that is a sin of the spirit person. Both are sinners. Okay, so we had this with Ninevites and Jonah. We also have this in the New Testament lots of times. We have this with a Pharisee and a tax collector. We have this with the prodigal son, the younger son, who goes out, sins of the flesh, and then the older brother who's judgmental and won't come into the party, sins of the spirit. We have this with the religious leaders. Remember when they brought the woman in adultery? They're there. They have the sins of the spirit. The woman, sins of the flesh. In all of these stories, here's what's interesting. The people who are guilty of the sins of the flesh knew that they were in big trouble, and they came to Jesus in their need. They finally came home. But the people who were guilty of the sins of the Spirit, people who had sort of been around God and his people for a longer time, usually, they were blind to their need. That's what pride does. They thought it was possible that they could love God and judge people. They thought they were spiritually mature because they had avoided the sins of the flesh. But they had no idea how crippling the sins of the Spirit were to their ability to love, which makes the sins of the Spirit perhaps the most dangerous and destructive. Let me put it another way. In that room, go back to this socially awkward room. The great sin in that room, what is it? It's not the sin that Simon thinks it is. The great sin in that room is that there are lips that don't kiss, and there are knees that don't bend, and there are eyes that won't weep, and there's money that won't be shared, and there's hands that won't serve, and there's perfume that will never leave the jar. Or to put it another way, it's the sin of a heart that won't break, or a life that won't change, or a soul that won't love. And if the greatest commandment is to love God and to love others, then the greatest sin is to refuse to obey the greatest commandment. Jesus, in effect, says this: Simon, don't you see? You are the biggest debtor of them all. And if Simon could have seen it, if he wasn't blind, if he could have seen it, what would he have done? He would have fallen down on his knees right beside this woman. Do you see? She needs grace for a heart that is broken, and he needs grace for a heart that is hard. They both need it. And so Simon the Pharisee is kind of taken back. Jesus says, hey, Simon, let me just make this real clear for you. Do you want to know why she kisses me and you don't even shake my hand? Do you want to know why you want to have an intellectual conversation and she's throwing herself at my feet? Do you want to know why you're interested in me, but she is absolutely overwhelmed and absolutely loves me? He says this powerful line. He says, the one who is forgiven much loves much. And the one who is forgiven little loves little. Whew. You ever trouble loving people? Anybody you got some bitterness against today? Some hardness in your heart? You don't have to point to anybody. Any impatience, irritability, judgment when you think of others? Anybody got a critical attitude? Jesus is saying, it's very powerful here. He's saying, it's simple math. Your ability to love others is dependent upon your awareness of how much you've been forgiven. To the degree that you see Jesus pouring out his life for you, to the degree that you know that you're a sinner saved by sheer grace, to the degree that you understand that I have forgiven you, to that degree you will have the love and joy and patience for the people around you. Your love is a response to how deeply forgiven you feel yourself to be. I'll look forward to that gift card. Jesus turns to Simon and says, listen, Simon, the thing is, it's not that you're moral and she's immoral. And by the way, it's not that she's authentic and you're a hypocrite. The real difference, the real reason she has love and she's pouring out her heart towards me, the real reason her repentance is deeper is because she knows the size of her debt. Do you know the size of your debt? She's so aware of her need for grace. And she is so overwhelmed that she can experience it in the presence of Jesus. Notice what she does. She empties her jar. What a response. When you understand how much you need grace and you understand where you can receive it, you empty your jar. You get extravagant. I thought about using a sermon illustration, like what kind of perfume could we erupt in this room so that we could really get into this message? I have a teenage son. I love that boy. And that boy loves to smell good. He's a cologne connoisseur. I don't know if you've met someone like this. He has many colognes. He'd be happy to tell you all about them. And you might not notice this if you walk by his room, because his room is a mixture of, a high-level athlete and a whole bunch of colognes mixed together. However, when he goes out, he smells good. He smells good. In fact, I guarantee you, if you go up to him today, I won't point him out, but if you go up to him today and you give him a hug, that's what all 17-year-old boys want you to do. If you give him a hug, you'll say, he smells good. Because he does. He smells good. He's got a cologne for everything. He's got a go to church cologne. He's got a go out on a date with his girlfriend cologne. He's got a cologne for exam taking. He's got a cologne for pizza for supper. He's got one for everything. You name it, he's got it. And I was looking at all of his colognes, and I wondered to myself this thought. What would our church smell like if we emptied our jar in response to grace? Because I got to be honest, this world stinks. Just found out on Friday, a teenager that I spent a lot of time with, died on the mountainside, 25 years old, skiing accident. This world stinks. And you know it. Not just in the pain and suffering of the world, you know it in your own pain and suffering, and not just the sins of the world, but in your own struggles. What would it be like to be a group of people who experienced grace and in response just emptied it all to Jesus for the sake of his kingdom? What would that be like? What was in that jar for her? All of her money, her reputation, her identity. What's in your jar? Your time. Will you empty it for the kingdom? Your treasure. It's been interesting over the years to talk to people who give a lot of money to kingdom things, donate a lot of money to the church. I remember talking to one fella. He donated a lot. Like, he made a lot of money, and his donations were not like in the hundreds or the thousands. They were in the 10, 20,000, $1 million range. And I said to him, like, that's a lot of emptying the jar. Like, well, why do you do that? A lot of things you could spend that money on. He says, I can't get over what God has done for me. Well, where do we take this message? Let me just suggest 3 questions. One is this: how aware are you of your own need for grace? Like, one of the most powerful things that we can do is remember how much we need grace, how much we need forgiveness. As soon as we forget that, it's so easy to step into Simon's house and act like Simon. Do you remember how much you need it? Some of you do, I know. Second question: how wonderful is the cross to you? You say, what do you mean? What does the cross have to do with this? Well, the cross is the place where Jesus poured out his entire life. Not for his own forgiveness, but for yours and mine. I put it this way to myself. How does it touch me when I sing Amazing Grace? Like, when was the last time that made it to my heart? Made it to my tears? Last question. How empty is your jar? What am I holding on to that God might be asking me to release, to let go of, to entrust to him? Because I believe that the more that you're aware of your need for grace, and the more that grace at the cross is amazing to you, the more that you will be able to love others, you will give extravagantly of your money and your time and your abilities, the more that you'll empty the jar. And when you empty the jar, it releases an aroma that is absolutely irresistible to the people in this city.